Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Policy in Practice's webinar for February. I'm delighted that you can join us today. Today's topic is designing council tax support schemes during a cost of living crisis. And I'm delighted that you can join us. Thank you very much for being here. So just while more people come online and join us, I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping. Those of you who have attended webinars of ours before will be familiar with this, but if I may ask you to, in the panel on your right hand side, raise your digital hand by way of an audio check. Let me know that you can hear me okay. That would be great, thank you. And then also in the same panel, you should be able to see where you can ask questions, and please do so throughout the webinar. We have plenty of time at the end for you to ask the questions of our speakers. We have a poll and a download and a short survey to keep it nice and interactive today. The short survey comes at the end of the session, so do give us your feedback, please. And we aim to have you on away by 11:45 today. I know I say it every time, but I always get this question. The slides and the recording will automatically follow, so no need to take copious notes. You'll be able to get that afterwards. And if you're on Twitter still, do give us a follow. We are at policy_practice, and we'll give you a follow back. Brilliant, thank you. So because we've got some new people on the webinar today, you're very welcome. Thanks for joining us. Just a couple of words about Policy in Practice. We're an organisation that believes in the power of data and technology to change lives, and we do that in a number of different ways. You might know us because of our policy work. We're regularly asked to speak in Parliament and at select committees. Indeed, Zoe Charlesworth, who's one of our speakers, is one of our main presenters. And we have extensive knowledge of the welfare system, and we're passionate about making social policy work. You might also know us from our data analytics. We help about well over 100 local authorities to use their administrative data to identify vulnerable households, target support and track interventions, something that's very interesting. And I suppose with the household support fund money that's been announced this week, that's something where LIFT can definitely help our analytics. And then finally, you might know us from our calculator, our award-winning calculator. It's one of the 3 free ones on gov.uk, and lots of people, it helps lots of people every day to look at increasing their income through the £19 billion of benefits that's unclaimed. So yeah, that's a little bit about us and what we do. What I'd like to do now, though, is introduce you more importantly to our speakers. So what I'm going to do is ask our speakers to put their cameras on, and hopefully you should be able to say hello and see them. Sorry, I'm working on a different system today. There we go. So my name is Janet Harkin. I look after the marketing team at Policy in Practice and run the webinars. Zoe, would you like to say hello?
Good morning.
Zoe Charlesworth, Associate Policy and Research Lead at Policy in Practice. And we're delighted to welcome our guest speaker, Corin Hammersley, Advice and Policy Manager from the Royal Borough of Greenwich. Corin, would you like to say hello?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me.
Lovely. Thanks for being here, Corin. And finally, my colleague, Alex Clegg, Senior Policy and Data Analyst at Policy in Practice. Do you want to say hello, Alex?
Hello, everyone.
Lovely. Brilliant. Thanks, everybody. And more from our speakers very soon. Thank you. OK, so today's agenda that we're looking at is the importance of council tax support schemes in a cost of living crisis. And Zoe's going to take us through the background and the policy context and actually what's happening out there, and some latest research to paint the picture. Then we're going to move on to Corin, who's going to really take us through the evolution of Greenwich's CTR schemes over the years, and also introduce you to their latest scheme and the considerations that they've had in designing that scheme. And then Alex is going to talk about the bigger picture, the latest national trends in scheme design and what the drivers for change are, and how to redesign your own scheme if that's what you're looking to do in order to reduce costs and stay generous within the context of universal credit. And also very practically looking at some features, pros and cons of 4 different types of schemes that you might want to consider. So hopefully you're in the right place, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Zoe for our first speaking session. Thanks, Zoe.
Thanks so much, Janet. Yeah, welcome everybody. What I'm going to do in this first session is just have a quick look at the cost of living crisis so that we can understand what we're talking about and how actually this feeds into CTR scheme design. Alex will be talking about the actual design elements, so going into a lot more detail. But I think first of all, let's remind ourselves of where we are. We're in a situation at the moment with unprecedented pressure on your residents. We've got the lowest real rate of benefit support for over 40 years. And this cost of living crisis, there's a disproportionate effect on low income households. There was a House of Commons briefing paper that acknowledged this, but I think the most interesting figure is from the Trussell Trust, who say the financial value of a 3-day supply of food has gone up 40%. And I think that's really telling that is the additional costs. The costs of those food parcels are similar to the costs that low-income households are having to meet in the last year or so. Because of this, the Resolution Foundation has estimated that an extra just under 3 million people will be in absolute poverty as we move into 2023-24, and that takes us up to just under a quarter of the population. 75% of households, this is extraordinary, 3/4 of households are going to be in fuel poverty in 2023, where over 10% of their net income is going to be spent on fuel. As expected with all these drivers, there's been a big increase in food parcels, a big increase in debt, because if there isn't enough income, you have to get your food from somewhere, and debt has been the first port of call for households who have not been able to make ends meet. The issue is we're getting to the situation where debt is no longer sustainable for people. They've basically maxed out all their credit cards. And this rise in a third, 33% in debt, going up to October last year, I think it's coming to an end and people are having to find other solutions. Next slide, please, Janet. Some figures that might basically just show how serious this is that my colleague Alex, who's speaking later today, and myself did some data analysis for the APPG around the adequacy of the benefit system. And it was quite startling that from April 2023, a third of households won't have sufficient income for basic outgoings. Now, when we're talking basic outgoings, I mean, there is a level to which people can cut back, and we do find that people on the lowest incomes are really, really good at managing their money, really good at cutting back as much as they can. But this is using really basic levels of outgoings, well below the standard financial statement trigger figures. And the group that's most affected is single renters. There's a lot of work in CTR schemes around vulnerable people, certainly people with disability and illness, and maybe some councils take into account people with children. But in fact, the group that's having the most difficulty to make ends meet is single person households who are renters. Thanks, Janet. And these pressures on households are coming at exactly the same time as unprecedented pressure on council finances. There's been a £15 billion real terms reduction in government funding for council since 2010. But this has really ramped up recently. Higher energy costs, higher wage costs meant that the budgets that were set last year have not been adequate for this year. And there's been an additional 2.4 billion of costs in the last year. And these pressures on council finances are happening at exactly the same time as more people are turning to councils as they fall into crisis. And this is predicted to be ongoing. Councils are facing a funding gap of over 3 billion next year, and this will actually rise into 2024-25. And it seems to me that every time you open a paper, there's another council that's sort of on the brink of bankruptcy. There's a very good quote here from the Local Government Association. Councils face a perfect storm from demand for services continuing to rise, just as the price of providing them is also escalating dramatically. This risks hampering council efforts to help level up communities and support residents through the cost of living crisis. Perfect. I mean, that just sums it up perfectly. So we're in a really unusual situation, and most council tax reduction schemes were designed where some of these drivers weren't around, and they were mostly produced in an iterative process. Each year they changed slightly, and what we're left with a lot of council tax reduction schemes that really have not taken into account the current pressure on residents, because they haven't been designed since the cost of redesigned or re-looked at or examined during the cost of living crisis. If we can move on to the next one, Janet. First obvious area is the maximum award of benefits. A lot of these, how much councils expected their low-income residents to contribute to their council tax, inched up bit by bit over years since localised council tax reduction was introduced. And it really didn't, what may have made sense over time really doesn't work in a cost of living crisis. When localised council tax was introduced, many councils introduced small amounts that they expected residents to pay. We're now at the situation where some councils expect people to pay 40% of their council tax, and these are your lowest income residents. We've got to remember that when localised council tax reduction was introduced, there wasn't an increase in benefit levels to cover this cost. And then following that, benefits were frozen. So we're now in a situation where benefit levels are at their lowest real term level for 40 years. But we've got this additional cost that we're putting on households that was never included when those benefit levels were set initially. In the least generous boroughs, residents with an average CT liability will need to pay over £50 a month towards their council tax. Remember, we have nearly a third of households who do not have enough to cover basic bills. And this postcode lottery creates a level of unfairness. Next slide, please, Janet. I've just put in some examples here just so you can see how stark this is, because I think it really is important to understand. I wear two hats. I work as a consultant at Policy and Practice, but I also work with frontline organisations. And I've actually brought in two real live cases of households we've been working with recently, where the cost of living crisis just means everything is unaffordable. This example is a single parent with 2 children, benefit catch, got rent at the local housing allowance, so we haven't got additional rent costs. And all her outgoings were well below the ONS third decile figures and seriously below any trigger figures. So she wasn't being extravagant. The council, the relevant council, had a maximum CTR support of 70%. So this resident is expected to pay £36 a month council tax. If you look at the graph on the left, and this is taken from our benefit calculator, I put all her details in there. She's £160 a month short. That's if she covers the very, very basic cost of bills and food for her family. So there is no way she can make £36 a month council tax. That is, in effect, uncollectible. Next one, please, Janet. And just a second example, because it's always useful to look at single people. These are the ones that are quite often forgotten in the design of schemes. And this was a woman who had been a carer for her husband. He died. She's in a housing association property. There's bedroom tax to pay because her eldest child had moved out. All her costs, again, well below an ONS average. There's nothing else you could take out on outgoings. Again, she had to pay 30% of her council tax liability, and she had to pay £30 a month. If you can see this, she's £81 short a month. So that council tax is uncollectible. Yeah, next one, please, Janet. And the result of this, outcomes are likely to be harmful. There's no outcome that isn't harmful for the resident. Either they're going to get into further debt. For many households, there's been a number of years of the cost of living crisis. It's been ramping up. There isn't the ability to take low interest debt anymore. They've used up all their credit cards. They're paying those back. So we've seen people move more and more to loan sharks and high interest credit. The mental health impacts just cannot be stated enough. Once somebody gets into serious debt, they quite often will refuse to engage with anyone. Just the pressure of day-to-day living becomes too much. And this obviously moves people further away from the employment market or making change. Lack of food, very harmful. Lack of heat, electricity, very harmful. There is no, to create debts and enforcement activity on uncollectible amounts is going to be harmful. And I just don't think there's any way around that. There's also, from the council's point of view, huge amounts of resources in chasing unrecoverable debts. We've got court preparation time, the administration of debt, administration of write-offs, and in the worst case scenario, the cost to the council of dealing with a crisis outcome such as homelessness. So all in all, there are harmful impacts of having these uncollectible debts. I don't think, I mean, my background is working in councils. I have worked in 3 different councils. Councils never mean to cause harm to residents. Councils are, all the councils I've worked in, people take their role in supporting residents very, very seriously. My feeling is that a lot of these schemes have crept into the design they are in now. And review is a big job. You've got to go out to consultation. It involves a lot of data analysis. It's a big work to change a scheme, but where we are now is that these schemes that have developed over the years just may not be suitable for your lowest income residents at the moment. Yeah, next slide. The next impact I want to talk around how your CTR design affects your lowest income residents is around backdating. This is something we see the whole time, is that once somebody claims universal credit, they often do not know to claim council tax reduction. By the time they claim council tax reduction, arrears have accumulated. And your problem with arrears accumulation is you're then paying off, the person is paying off arrears each month, so their ability to pay ongoing council tax is reduced. So not only is it difficult to collect the arrears, but further arrears end up accumulating. This gap between UC claim and CTR claim is really problematic, and most council tax reduction schemes still only have a month's backdating and don't automatically backdate or have provision for backdating to a start of a UC claim. Partially the problem is we know that when people make a claim for universal credit, when they first see their work coach, those work coaches are under tremendous pressure. They don't have time to do income maximisation and check people are claiming everything they should be claiming. There's also huge confusion around what is a discount and council tax reduction. Quite often, DWP will say, do you want to claim council tax? Are you claiming discount? They'll look up discount and it's around severe mental impairment, it's around empty properties. They start thinking this isn't for them, because council tax reduction and discount are used interchangeably. Everybody who works in councils knows the difference, but externally, many people think that this is not something they can apply for. And automatic backdating, having backdating written into your scheme to cover this gap, prevents ongoing problems. It may mean that your resident can continue paying ongoing council tax and they're not having to pay off arrears at the same time. Thanks, Janet. The next area that has a cost of living having an impact on your CTR scheme design is making most of your data. And the reason for this is it's just a bit of a wake-up call. With such pressure on council finances, optimising the data you have is really useful, not just to the council administration and reducing administration costs, but also useful to the residents. A lot of councils, the majority of councils now, automate the CTR claim if someone has stated they wanted to claim CTR when they claim UC, and that's the new claim record comes across. CTRs automatically put into payment. But Probably about half of councils then ask for an application form to back that up. Now, the issue with that is if that application form doesn't come in, then the claim is stopped. And I think councils need to review, are you asking for information? Are you asking for a new application when it's not really necessary? Obviously, in some cases, there's verification of data. There's some of the data from DWP you might not be completely comfortable with, and you may want to get some further information from the claimant. But I think that does need a review, just so that you're not creating arrears. And we go back to the situation I mentioned earlier, where the repayment of arrears prevents ongoing payment of council tax liability. Thanks, Janet. And councils can also use their data in different ways. There's a lot of talk at the moment, a lot of discussion around councils, particularly with the cost of living crisis, around segmentation of debtors. There's been a lot of, I suppose council debt collection has been in the spotlight because of the private sector upping their game. But the enforcement practices by public sector bodies has been in the spotlight over the last few years. But when councils talk about segmentation, they always talk about vulnerability, which is they segment, generally that's around people being ill, disabled. And that's great. That segmentation allows you to take those into account and people's ability to engage. Take that into account in enforcement activity. But what is rarely taken into account is a calculation about affordability. Most councils, particularly if people are in receipt of universal credit, can calculate if people can meet minimum outgoings. If you can't, I mean, small councils just don't have the data analysis. They don't have the resources to do this themselves. There is software out there, for example, PIP's Lift Dashboard, and there are other methods to use your data to find out who cannot afford to pay their council tax. And that is a really important group to segment, because those claimants actually need they need income maximisation way more than they need enforcement activity. If you're hoping to get ongoing payment of council tax liability and they can't meet current costs, you're going to have to do something to help either maximise income and check that outgoings can't be reduced, movement of social tariffs, this sort of reduction in outgoings. But if you want to collect council tax liability, if you have a minimum charge for your poorest residents, you are going to have to do something around having a real examination of the income of households, because enforcement activity will go nowhere. Those debts just are not collectible. And I would also say that we've seen some lovely work with councils who immediately trigger attempts to engage with one missed payment, not waiting till council tax arrears have really ramped up, but they start looking at offering income maximisation and income support to people following one missed council tax liability payment. And that data, all your arrears data, your data from council tax arrears, if you have your own property rent arrears, but any other debts to the council can be used to inform council households that may well be in crisis. Thanks, Janet. So I'm just finishing there. That was just setting the scene, because I do feel we're at a situation where a lot of CTR schemes have grown up over the years. We're in a very different landscape now for your residents. And perhaps it's time to review those schemes to see if they meet the needs of residents now. And part of that review is obviously understanding how many of those residents actually are in negative income month to month. So just a quick summary. Review of the maximum CTR. You need to understand your residents. Can they pay it? What proportion can pay it? Which households can pay it? Which households can't pay it, because otherwise you will end up with uncollectible debt. Backdating provision needs a serious review, because certainly with managed migration rolling out, those arrears are just going to make things worse for people, because paying off the arrears means you can't pay ongoing liability. Look at automation to save money for the council as much as possible, but also to prevent the build-up of those arrears as people move to universal credit. Use council benefit data to segregate debtors into those not just who are vulnerable, but those who actually just can't afford to pay and perhaps need some other level of support. And in fact, if you don't support those residents, it's unlikely you'll be able to they'll be able to pay ongoing council tax liabilities. And make the most of the arrears data, because it really informs that somebody's in trouble and may need some support. Thanks, Janet.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Zoe. Thank you very much. So at this point, before we hand over to Corin, I promised a poll, and here it comes. So let me put it up on the screen now. And what we're asking you to answer is, what do you want to achieve by changing your CTR scheme? Big assumption in there, of course. So let's just look at that there on your screen. Hopefully you can see that right now. So what do you want to achieve by changing your CTR scheme? The first, and there are 5 options, please choose one. So is it that you want to increase generosity? Do you want to reduce your administration costs? Do you want to increase take-up? Do you want to maximise automation? And I suppose the point there is to increase generosity and reduce income admin costs at the same time. Or are you not changing, or you're not sure yet? And if you're not sure, is there anything that we can help you with? What questions do you have? Brilliant. So thank you. I can see that people are voting as we speak. And once I close this poll in just a few seconds time, the results will come up on the screen, and I will ask our next speaker, Corin, to comment on the results. So thank you, everybody, for voting. I'm going to close the poll now and share the results up there on the screen. Brilliant. Thank you. So Corin, over to you. What would you say in terms of the results from that poll?
I guess that doesn't surprise me hugely, because I'm completely aware of the challenges in administering schemes and the impact that's having, particularly with universal credit increasing and the volume of notifications. So I'm not surprised in terms of admin costs coming out on top. And I guess kind of like generosity and take-up are similar, in a similar vein, really, in terms of trying to support residents.
Brilliant, lovely, thank you. Let me hide those results and come back to our slides and hand over to yourself now, Corin. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for having me today. The first thing I've noticed that I suspect that we all use a slight variation of an acronym for this. So in Greenwich, we kind of tend to call it LCTS, Local Council Tax Support. But I have a feeling we all probably vary that a little bit in terms of what we refer to the scheme. But I think we're all talking about the same thing. I'm sure we are. Thanks, Janet. Okay, so I'm just going to start with kind of the background of our scheme and the kind of the journey we've been on. So it's 10 years ago that the schemes were localised and devolved to local authorities. And so we started probably very similar to everyone else. We started with the default scheme with maximum support of 85%. And so we kind of replicated the council tax benefit as was. Between kind of 2013 and 2020, we didn't make any changes to our scheme at all. And so during that time, there were various changes to housing benefit made on the basis of savings, and we didn't make any of those or apply any of those into our council tax support scheme. So I'm thinking of the change to the backdating provision, the 2-child limit, changes to temporary absence rules. So we did not apply any of those in our scheme. Politically, so during 2016-2017, we had a Fairness Commission that undertook a review in the borough of a whole range of policies and areas And one of the areas that they focused on and picked up on was our council tax support scheme. And a recommendation came out of that to increase the support back up to 100%. And so that was something that was became a priority politically in the borough. Due to various reasons, mainly capacity, it wasn't really until 2019 that we were able to follow through with that recommendation. I think in 2018 we were really focused on the rollout of universal credit, and I should probably say my background is welfare rights, so I'm also manage the welfare rights service as well as lead on the policy side of what we do, and so probably my welfare rights head and my welfare rights background influenced to an extent the direction that we're going in as well. So yes, it was 2019 that we focused on this to make change, focused on our scheme so that we could make changes from 2020. Thanks, Janet. So in terms of making the changes for then, I think we were probably a bit behind. I suspect that most authorities by this point had already made changes, maybe probably various changes to their scheme by that point. But this is the first time. We had quite a clear political steer at that time in that nobody was to lose entitlement. So that was quite a strong position to make. Again, helpful for me with my welfare rights hat as well. And the top priority was that to increase the support back up to 100%. And we did that for all households, including single households without dependents or disabilities. And that was quite important for me, and that's kind of mirroring some of the comments Zoe was making, is that recognising that, you know, single adult households had the lowest income, they were probably impacted by the most number of reforms, and, you know, if we didn't increase the support for those, the likelihood is, you know, they were the households that were most likely to struggle with paying any minimum contribution anyway. So it was quite an important priority for me that it was all households that were included. We did consider whether we would cap the banding, because I know that happens in some cases, but again, kind of going back to the political steer that they didn't want anyone to lose out, and so in the end that option was discounted. The other big change that we made is that we still had backdating provision at 6 months because we hadn't changed it, but we dropped the provision to require good cause for backdating. And so essentially, if there was entitlement, we could automatically backdate a council tax support claim for up to 6 months. So that was another change that we implemented at that time. So kind of reflecting and probably putting this together, thinking back, the process. So we started the modelling process mid-end summer 2019, and in hindsight, that was too late. You know, we should have started them. Basically, if you want to make changes for 2024, you need to start now. You need a year really to go through the modelling, consider the results. Probably you may want more modelling done, and then to go through the political and the consultation process. But so we got it done, but it was tight in terms of time-wise. So I mean, for us, it meant that these changes were implemented in January, February 2020. There was actually there were also decisions made at the council that made our local welfare assistance scheme was made permanent, and our welfare rights service was increased as well. I mean, how fortuitous it was that we made those changes in January, February 2020, knowing what was coming up in the next couple of months. So it definitely put us in a stronger position going forward because we made these changes, but we had no idea at the time what was to come. Thanks, Janet. So just kind of the last couple of years, what's happened? So, and I guess kind of on the back of, well, March, April 2020, as we received, as every authority did, when we received the COVID hardship funding, so that was kind of the first response from the government, so that provided the kind of discretionary LCTS payments. Because we had a scheme providing 100%, we we had a lot of that funding remaining, and that's even in that first year we increased the payment up to £300, so that was double the recommended amount by the government at that time. So essentially, members here liked those payments, and so because we had remaining funding, that enabled us to continue those payments in 2021 and 2022, varying amounts in terms of how much that was, but yeah, so those payments have had continued each year, although there was a degree of administration in processing those. So when we did have an aspiration and a political aspiration to try and continue those payments in a way, but we were keen to kind of embed that within the scheme. And so that's where kind of the idea developed to look at our earnings taper, which would largely support the same cohort of residents, so residents who didn't receive full council tax support. The other kind of advantage of looking at the earnings taper is that it's a way to kind of increase the earnings incentive within the scheme, so that residents in work on low incomes they keep more of their earnings as it increases. So they keep more of their earnings, and their LCTS scheme entitlement reduces at a lower rate. There was another change that we were keen to look at was also our non-dependent deductions, and to move to a flat rate. And from a service, our motivation for this was come from an administrative point of view. We knew it would be easier to administer the scheme, and also it would be simpler to understand for residents. And we were conscious that it's a challenge to ensure that we've got the correct data and information regarding non-dependence, and we suspect that there are cases where we don't. And so moving to a flat rate non-dependent deduction would make that easier, and we knew that that's also quite common in other authorities as well. And I think kind of also throughout this time, towards the end of 21, I think the cost of living was starting to emerge coming out of COVID. I think we just experienced the loss of the UC £20 uplift on universal credit. There were discussions on at a high level from councillors and from politicians locally in terms of what are the mechanisms within the local authority to provide support. And so really within the local authority, our council tax support scheme is one of the only routes that we have to provide direct financial provision on an ongoing basis. So that's why that's what led to these discussions. Thanks, Janet. Okay, so that kind of paved the way really for us to looking at our scheme again. So because of those discussions at the end of 21, we anticipated that there would be a request to look at our scheme again. We started with our modelling really early, and I was feeling really smart about it in that. So kind of end of 2021, we started with a modelling request through policy and practice in reducing our taper rate and moving to a non-dependent deduction. But then so we got those results back kind of in the early part of 2022, but then we we're going into the local elections and PERDA, and actually the outcome of that for us locally is we had a new leader and a new political administration. We've background in Greenwich is that it's a Labour council and a very strong Labour council, so that's not changed, but there were changes in terms of the leader and people involved. So I guess, and from that, the new leader, they had a very strong focus and priority on cost of living, which established the cost of living task force. And so it took a little while for that to establish and for that to embed into kind of understand the priorities and how that was moving forward. And so it was more in the summer and probably towards the end of the summer again that the council tax support scheme came up as a consideration. So we picked up the modelling again. There were areas where we needed to remodel, So again, we looked at our non-dependent, so we looked at different flat rates for non-dependent deductions, so that resulted in going back to policy and practice. So yeah, so I think I lost all my advantage of time, well, I think I lost a lot of the time advantage that I hoped that I had, and that we were again towards the end of the summer and looking to make changes for this year. So with going through the modelling process and the results that we've got, I think I kind of recognised quite early on that the changes we were looking to make were more focused on certain cohorts of residents, whereas previously when you're looking at the maximum amount someone can pay or the minimum contribution, that has an effect on a wider range of cohorts. So for these ranges, it was we focused our attention in considering what the impact was based on employment status, and it was less helpful to look at the results based on income band, or rather on, I should say, probably council tax band, because sometimes that's another way that you can consider the results. What I did learn through the process that I needed to build in time to explain to both councillors and my director kind of the mechanics of the council tax support scheme, because by now we're getting into the real technical details of how a council tax support scheme is applied and how entitlement is calculated. So I remember quite a interesting session in trying to, essentially I think I was trying to train our leader and director over what a non-dependent deduction was and what an earnings taper. And I suspect I've probably got some revenues and benefits colleagues on here who probably can probably relate to. That's not the most straightforward conversation for them to pick up straight away, because it's important that they understood what these areas were so that they could advocate for these changes. So that was an interesting process. So as I mentioned, so we were kind of a bit pushed for time, but so our consultation closed on Boxing Day, and in between Christmas and New Year I was drafting the report, so not quite as in advance as I'd like to be, but we got it done. And so these changes have been approved and applied to our scheme, and they will apply from 2023, from April. Thanks, Janet. So then just to kind of give an overview where we are at with our scheme, what our scheme will be from April, is so we still have a means tested scheme, or a default scheme as we commonly refer to it, a maximum support of up to 100% for all claimants. We have our 6 months backdating provision. We are going down to a 15% earnings taper for working age residents, and we are moving to a flat rate non-dependent deduction of £5. So I think that's the main kind of highlights in terms of the main features of our scheme. I think there are also things that we don't have, so we don't have the 2-child limit and those other kind of rules that apply to housing benefits. So we're conscious that we have a strong scheme to support residents, and I'm proud that we have that we are able to support residents with to this level, you know, because we're seeing every day the impact the cost of living crisis is having on residents. So it's one way that we can provide that support. Thank you. I think this is my last slide really. And then just kind of thinking about our scheme going forward, I think that there may well be future changes to our scheme, and may well be changes in the next year or two again, but more looking at the administration of our scheme and how we can improve that further. So very much aligning with what the response is in the poll. I can't see that there would be any plans to move to a banded or discounted scheme in the authority in the near future. I think it's more going to be focused on how we can improve the administration further. So I think we are taken with the considering, can we use UCDS notifications for a new claim? Can we apply a tolerance so that we are not processing as many change of circumstances notifications per month? So, but they're less about they're less about kind of the direct cost implications of the scheme, and more about the ease of administering the scheme. Get say that word properly. I think, and then just kind of highlighting, just really in Greenwich, we recognise that. So the council tax support, that is kind of the main route we have that we control in providing financial support and ongoing financial support. And that, you know, that's complemented by the other provision we have. So we've got a local welfare assistance scheme, we've got a school clothing grant scheme. So that's really a way that we can help with one-off costs, which we recognise that's also really important, because it's those one-off unexpected costs where it may push someone who might be just about managing and push them into needing emergency support or food bank support. So that's why we recognise the importance of that provision. And then kind of the financial support we provide is complemented by the advice provision that we have in the borough. And as being a welfare rights manager, this is probably not going to surprise you that I say this, but I think the advice provision is so important. And local authorities are so well placed to provide this. You know, linking it back again to what Zoe said about data, that the data that we have available to us and that we can access gives us such an advantage in terms of we can go further with the advice support we can provide. We can provide targeted take-up campaigns and work with those residents who are presenting as being in council tax debt or rent arrears. As though kind of we're kind of pushing this direction further, so really focus around money advice support. So where residents are struggling with their council tax bills, can we assist with income maximisation? Can we provide advice regarding reducing their household expenditure? Can we assist them in reaching affordable repayment arrangements? And that's for council debt. So obviously that's in our interest that we can get a resident to that point, but also other debts as well. And for some of those, it might be seeking them to get to a different debt management option, insolvency, if that's really needed. And I'd probably say having such advice provision is even more important if we don't have a 100% support scheme, but I'm quite glad in Greenwich that we do. I think that's my last slide, Janet.
Brilliant, it is. Thank you so much, Corin, for very comprehensively taking us through Greenwich's journey and where you're at right now. I do encourage people to ask questions in the panel, and we will get to them after we've heard from our next speaker, which is Alex. Thanks very much, Corin, and over to you, Alex.
Hello, thank you, Janet. Hello, everyone. Good morning. I wanted to start just by going over some national trends in CTR scheme design, what are councils doing around the country. We model every council's CTR scheme for our benefit calculator. It gives us a good overview of what the sort of national picture is. And actually, I'll say thank you to everyone so far who's let us know that they are changing the scheme in April. We're currently reviewing all of the schemes, which is quite a big job, and a number of councils have already told us whether or not they're changing, which is very helpful. So thank you for that. So at the moment, there are still 180 councils around the country that have a maximum award of 100% of CT liability. This includes all of Scotland and Wales. However, 40 of this 180 do have ban restrictions, so not every household will be able to access that 400% if they live in a property with a council tax band that is has a higher amount than the limit. 119 councils have between 80 and 99% maximum awards. 54 have 65 to 89%, and there is still one that does have 50% only. And around 60 councils have protection for vulnerable groups, which is often households with a disability benefit, with lone parents with young children. That covers it mostly. There are a few that have specific groups, but yeah, that's the picture there. And just a bit of analysis. We did a quick calculation, and the difference between the most generous and least generous schemes is around £1,300 a year for a household in a Band B property, which is more than the £20 uplift in universal credit during the pandemic. It's a really serious amount that's going to have quite a big impact on household finances, especially for people on the lowest income. So something to consider there. Next slide, please, Janet. There has also been quite an increasing prevalence of banded schemes in the last 4 or 5 years. This sort of only started around 2018, when there was just 2. This year there is 70 banded schemes in the country, and we're expecting quite a lot more to come. As you know, a lot of the modelling that we've done this year, people have been very interested in banded schemes. We'll go more into the details of different scheme design and the pros and cons a little later, but I think one overarching thing that councils are looking at are ways to maintain the generosity or increase the generosity, but on really tight budgets. And one advantage of banded schemes is a reduction in admin costs. So I think that's why we're seeing quite a big increase in the number of those. Next slide, please. So what are some of the drivers for change when considering a new scheme? This is particularly at the moment the main ones that we are coming up against in consultations. What the councils, what's really driving their thinking behind changing schemes. A big one, as Zoe alluded to, and as I think you can imagine, is alleviating poverty, preventing poverty within the cost of living crisis is really important. It's really important for the resident, but also for the council in terms of collections, in terms of the cost of ongoing crisis support, extra burdens that come along with that for the council. Second major one is to reduce the admin burden of administering schemes. It's going to be around 1/3 of CTR spending. You can do this by automating claims using data. You can design a scheme so there's less need for repeat billing or to minimize debt collections. And also just reducing the confusion for claimants is a really important thing to drive take up. I think it's really interesting that Corin mentioned that a lot of councillors and directors don't understand these schemes. So some of the more complicated ones, I don't know how we expect residents to get their heads around them, and I think that is one of the barriers to take up. Another thing that we need to consider is managed migration to universal credit. It feels like it's a little bit bogged down. It feels like it's always being pushed back a little, but within the next 5 years or so, there is going to be a lot of legacy households migrating to universal credit. So you need to think about, does your universal credit scheme, the way your scheme interacts with universal credit, does that still meet your objectives? Is there going to be winners and losers there as households migrate? And the final point there is to look at the inequality between legacy and universal credit claimants. We do see universal credit, on average, people on universal credit do on average have slightly lower awards just because of how it interacts with that benefit. Next slide, please. Some more factors that we go through when we consult with councils who are looking to do modelling. These are all the different drivers that might affect scheme design more widely. A lot of it can just be a sort of steer from members or from directors, political considerations, what they're able to do, what kind of budget they have. I think is a big one at the moment. As I'm sure a lot of you are aware, council budgets are very stretched at the moment. I won't go through all of these, but this is just a kind of an overview picture of all the different details to consider when designing a scheme. Next slide, please. So what are the pros of using modelling when designing a new scheme? A big one is that you can really tell how a new scheme might reflect local policies and commitments. If you've been tasked by members to produce a scheme that has a certain impact, we can show you exactly what impact it's going to have. That feeds into the second point, to understand what the impact of changes will be. You'll have data to inform scheme design, but also data to provide to member inquiries and to public consultation. Third one is to understand the impact of universal credit on scheme costs, levels of support. As managed migration accelerates, you don't want to be caught out there in terms of how much the scheme will cost. Households that might lose out or that might gain support. In particular, certain groups, and this is often a bit unforeseen, you might make a change and certain groups or demographics may have excessive losses in support that you might not have seen coming. We're able to show exactly the changes in expected award, and also to understand the impact of doing nothing. We always show the impact that your scheme will have if you leave it as it is over the next few years, taking into account uprating, inflation, etc. How much your scheme will cost, what the different impacts will be on your residents if you don't make any changes. I think that's often overlooked, but an important thing to consider. Next slide, please. So now going more into the details of scheme design, I'm going to touch on two of the main points that have come up in almost all of the modelling that we've done so far this year. First one is just how to alleviate poverty. Everybody knows their residents are struggling a lot at the moment. And two big things you can do with that are, number one, to increase the generosity of the scheme. Zoe and Corin have both talked about the importance of the maximum award and how raising that will support all the residents on your scheme. The higher that award is, it means that everyone's award starts from a higher point, and you won't be chasing, ideally you won't be chasing people for money for council tax that they just can't pay. You can look at protecting vulnerable groups, people on no income, people in receipt of disability benefits, lone parents. As Zoe said, often it's single households that get overlooked there. I think that's something that should always be considered from now on. A lot of analysis at the moment is showing single households in particular are really struggling through this crisis. And with the benefits system in general, there's not a lot of extra protections built in. And that's somewhere where if you don't look at those groups, you may start seeing them increasing the levels of debt that they have. The third one there is lowering the taper rate, the earnings taper rate, which is the amount of how quickly your award is tapered away with your earnings. Not super common to see this. I really like this as an approach. I think Greenwich might be the first one to do this year. It's something to consider especially if one of the political commitments is to support households that are in employment to keep more of their earnings. And the second major way you can alleviate poverty is just to make sure that everybody who is entitled to CTR within your borough is claiming it. This can be achieved. An easy win is just through a clear application process, a well-publicised scheme on the website. Think about how simple your scheme is to understand. CTR is, especially with universal credit being being advertised as an all-encompassing benefit, a lot of people don't know that they need to claim CTR alongside it. So it is quite underclaimed. Also, be proactive. Use your data that you have to target households, especially those that move to universal credit. In the universal credit data share, you know if they've ticked that they're interested in claiming CTR and they haven't claimed it yet, you can directly target these households using data. We can help you do that at Policy in Practice if it's something you're interested in. The third one is to automate applications using that same data set. So with the right scheme design, something that I'll go into in a later slide, you can automate or move towards automation of applications as much as possible by tweaking your scheme so that information in that universal credit data share can be used as an application, which we'll go into. Next slide, please. So the second major thing that's been coming up recently is how to reduce costs, especially with council budgets being what they are at the moment. It's been quite heartening. I think that we haven't actually had any consultations or any modelling projects this year where councils have wanted to reduce generosity in order to save costs, and I think that's just an understanding that that's not really something that's feasible with residents struggling so much. So how else can you reduce costs whilst maintaining the generosity of the scheme? The main thing to target is administrative savings. Scheme design can help you reduce the need for reassessments, particularly thinking of income-banded schemes there, but you can also set limits for how much earnings would need to change to trigger a reassessment. Simplify the assessment process. Use what you can from data to fill in bits of the application. A big one here, I think one of the things we really want to stress with this whole webinar is avoid false economies. Zoe talked about the problems with having a low maximum reward. There's also problems with having a maximum reward of, say, 95%. Households on negative budgets can't afford to pay even 5% of their council tax. And that how much the council might be saving by having a 95% max instead of 100% maximum reward needs to be offset against the costs of households going into debt, the costs of collections that never end up recovering that money. So yeah, these things can be considered. They can be modelled using your benefits and arrears data. I think that's one of the important takeaways I think from today. Yeah, and just going into costs further, just alongside admin costs is reducing the cost of collection and ongoing costs of debt. Debt is obviously very costly to the claimant. It spirals. You end up in higher interest arrears with unscrupulous lenders and things like that. Also, these days courts can only really attach benefits to debts. It's very difficult for councils to actually recover arrears from households who just can't pay it. And then councils are going to end up having extra costs for things like advice, mental health and crisis support services that come along with being in debt. There's a link here, when you get the slides, there's a link here to some research we did for the GLA a couple of years ago, which interestingly showed that scheme generosity and local poverty rates were the only things that are significantly associated with collection rates. So the strictness or otherwise of collection practices didn't really have an effect on collection rates. What that showed is people who can pay generally do pay, and if they can't pay, that's why they're not. If people aren't paying, it's usually because they can't, and that's something to consider when thinking about where to set that maximum reward for your scheme. Next slide, please. And the third thing with managed migration accelerating is how does your scheme interact with universal credit? Households on UC tend to receive lower CTR on average, but that obviously depends on the design of the scheme. But then there is a greater retention of earnings on universal credit. I think one really important thing to consider is the overall income of the household, not just from CTR, but from their earnings, from universal credit, from other benefits, and how all of these interact. And that's something that the modelling can show and the data can show. And with more people using universal credit, that increases the potential to use UC data to streamline administration, cut administration costs, and also to boost the automation of applications and increase take-up. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to finish up, I'm going to go over four main types of schemes, the most popular types of schemes, some details on pros and cons of each one. Next slide. The first thing is how to maximize automation by aligning your scheme to UC data. This is usually tweaks to a scheme, just making sure that everything that you ask for in an application can be gleaned from the universal credit data share data set. Schemes can be based on the default means tested scheme, or they can be income banded, but with using these parameters. So using the UC award for household information, using the UC award for the UC data for net income, having flat rate non-dependent deductions. This is because we don't have information on non-dependent earnings within the UC data. Using the DWP's own assessment for self-employed income, so that avoids having to do that assessment yourself. We don't receive information on households that are on DLA or PIP within the UCDS data, so you would use LCW, LCWRA status as a proxy for that. Exclude housing costs and remove earnings deductions based on the number of hours worked. If you can tweak your scheme in that way, that means you can use most of the information in the UCDS data set to automate applications. Next slide, please. So still the most popular scheme option is revising the default scheme based on the old council tax benefit before it was devolved. So this is, I'm sure most of you understand how it works, but basically what happens is the award is reduced with earnings over an applicable amount per household, which is based on the demographic makeup of that household. The pros here, there aren't any cliff edges in support like there are in some of the other types of scheme. It's generally understood with benefits that a gradually tapered away award as earnings increase is the fairest way to go. And there's a lot of details in the scheme that can be tweaked to meet certain objectives. So you can make admin savings by moving to flat rate non-dependent deductions. You can introduce a minimum award, so you're not making awards of a few pennies that involve extra administrative work. You can introduce de minimis rules. This is where you don't trigger a reassessment unless earnings change by a certain amount. And as we've talked about, you can alleviate poverty by increasing the maximum award, introducing protected groups, and looking at your taper rate. The cons here are that the scheme is complex. Residents often don't understand the award. It can put people off applying. And without some of these tweaks made, there is often a need for repeat reassessments as circumstances change, which can be costly. Next slide, please. So income banded schemes, these are set income bands, each with corresponding percentage discounts. They can be based on the entire household income or just with earnings. That's something that you need to carefully set out with the modelling process. And they often build in protection for larger households. So, for instance, the earnings band will be slightly larger if it's a couple than if it's single, or if they have more than one child, etc. The pros here are it's often significantly cheaper to administrate, as when earnings change, households, unless they go over that band threshold, they will keep the same award. And it's much more simple for residents to understand. They can usually look at one of these charts on the website, see where their earnings are, and then see what percentage discount they will get. The cons here it does introduce small cliff edges in support as households move into the higher bands. So, you might jump from 100% of your council tax being discounted. As you go into the next band, you might jump to 70%, just by going over that threshold. And that does introduce these jumps. one way we try and alleviate that is to just introduce more bands, so those jumps are smaller and people don't notice so much of a big increase in the amount of council tax that they have to pay as they change income. Next slide, please. The final type of scheme I wanted to discuss are discount schemes. So these are similar to income banded schemes, but they just look at the household makeup rather than earnings. This makes them much easier to assess, much cheaper to administrate, and also much simpler for residents to understand. They can see exactly what band they might fit into. This graph here, by the way, is just an example. You can set different percentages, different groups, different ways. The cons here, the highest support may not go to the households who are struggling the most. If you're not looking at income, you may, as we've seen, single households are often struggling. They may be overlooked in the design of these schemes, which could make them seen as unfair. They're also quite politically difficult, these schemes. There will be winners and losers in terms of the overall amount of award that different households get. So there can be some barriers to implementing these schemes. But if they can be done in the right way, they can be quite powerful in terms of their simplicity. Next slide, please. Okay, just to sum up, why now is the time to redesign your scheme? Things have changed. The cost of living crisis is having a really significant effect on the lowest income residents, and there's going to be a lot of increased cost that comes along with that. There is a burden to administrate, and just it's really important for councils to be able to help people on the lowest incomes to get through this. Also, council budgets are so tight that administrative savings are really important. As we've gone over, managed migration TC is accelerating. With that comes data gets all the more powerful as that universal credit data share data gets enriched and grows. There's a lot of powerful things you can do with that in terms of automation. And amidst all the uncertainty for residents and for councils, analytical modelling can show you exactly the impact that a scheme change will have, both in terms of impact for the residents and cost for the council. And my final thing I want to leave you with today is please start early with modelling. We do get really busy with this in the summertime. It's towards the end of the summer, autumn time that you need to go out to consultation to get ready in time for the following April. So if you are considering changes for April 2024, please get in touch now so we can begin those conversations and start the modelling process. Okay, I think that's me. Thank you very much for listening. Back to you, Janet.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Alex. It's great to hear all of your points, and thank you very much to Corin and Zoe as well. I do have some questions which I'm just going to put to our speakers, if that's okay. So I don't know if Corin and Zoe, you want to get your microphones and your videos on. Perfect, lovely. I'm very happy for whoever to take any of these questions, but maybe perhaps I'll put this one to you, Corin, if I may, first of all, and it's to do with automation. So this person says, automation may cut staffing costs, but what happens to those who need further assistance, or, for example, they cannot read or access a computer? What would you say on that? How did you deal with that point at Greenwich?
In terms of residents being able to claim council tax support, I think that there's an important role there for advice and support with that. And this is definitely something that we picked up during COVID, in that we increased our support for residents who needed to apply online, and provided support. We provided that digital support for residents, so we would help someone. We will go through the application with them over the phone to help them to submit the claim, and also, and then in terms of ongoing queries, there's telephone support and advice support available for residents. So we think we've got quite a strong wraparound model through various routes to support residents who need help with their claim.
Brilliant, lovely, thank you. And another one, Corin, I suppose that for you, how do you keep a generous scheme but also keep it affordable? What groups would you target to get the best impact?
Well, I guess that's difficult for me to answer. I think there are, in terms of how we afford it, I think there are just political decisions made, of which they're not my decision, and how we afford it, I think I need the Director of Finance to come and answer that, because that's above my pay grade to know that level of detail. So I guess I don't have the answer to that. Janet, what's the second part of the question?
Sorry, so the second part of the question was, what groups would you target to get the best impact?
That's really difficult, because I think it's really hard to identify a group that doesn't need it. When you're looking at a low-income resident, you know, do you look at who has the lowest income? So there's your single adult households. They will literally have the lowest income. Do you look at the households with children? And obviously you don't want to reduce the amount of support you give to households with children. And if they've got ill health and disabilities, we know there's additional costs associated with that. Again, I don't think I've got an answer to say which of those groups to target. To be honest, I think any resident on a low income needs support. That's not an easy or helpful answer, but I don't know how you can. I think it's really difficult to identify one group out of those prioritised, and that's when I'm really glad that those decisions ultimately need to be made by politicians, not me.
Anything to add to that, Zoe or Alex, from work we've seen perhaps with other clients?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things. Sorry, Alex, over to you after. A couple of things I'd just like to say. First of all, about whether it's what is affordable or not. I think quite often when these decisions are made, we're not looking at the affordability of the amount of work that goes into trying to collect uncollectible debts. And the schemes may well have made sense when they were first introduced, but when you've got almost a third of your residents who actually just can't pay any bills, the administration that goes into trying to collect those uncollectible debts is enormous. And not, I mean, it's difficult for the resident because you end up with court costs and other costs on top of the debt. But it's very difficult for the council every time somebody asks for Section 13A, discretionary support write-offs. You've got to read all those, you've got to deal with all those, you've got to work with your bailiffs. There's a lot of work going in, a lot of cost in goes towards uncollectible debts. So I think that when we look at what's affordable, sometimes that isn't taken into account. It's like, this is a budget for council tax reduction, we've got to reduce budgets, but actually, are we preventing knock-on costs? And the other point about where the biggest impact is, we have actually worked with some councils. Obviously, every council has different choices. Every council has different financial pressures. They've made different investment choices in the past. The finances of each council are individual to that council. But we have worked with quite a lot of councils that have limited manoeuvre in this space. And we've looked at their arrears data. We've looked at their arrears data just to see where the biggest impacts are, but also we can run the data through our engine to find out actually the groups that are being impacted most, and the groups that the groups that are affected by the cost of living crisis the most. So we have worked with councils doing that. If there were limited groups they can support, we have tried to, at least where councils are making decisions, it's good to have the data behind you to make their decision, that decision. Because it's great what's happening in Greenwich. It's just really heartening to see, isn't it? But I don't think that's an options that are necessarily available to all councils.
Lovely, thanks, Zoe. Anything, Alex, that you'd like to add?
No, I think that covers it. Yeah, just that it's something to weigh up in each area. It depends on obviously what the current scheme is doing, you know, in terms of where that support is, and if it can be. I mean, you're looking at redistribution, I guess. If it's not possible to increase the budget for the scheme, you're looking at redistribution, and you know, as Zoe said, where people just cannot afford to pay their liabilities and end up in debt, I think is probably where you'd want to focus. But it is, you know, it does need looking at, but on a sort of council by council and case by case basis.
Okay, thank you, Alex and Zoe. Corin, back to you. How does reducing the number of calculations reduce the sheer and overwhelming number of electronic notifications from the DWP regarding universal credit, which still need to be processed even in simpler banded schemes? Corin, I've pointed that one to you. Forgive me if it's not for you, it might be for somebody else, but maybe you could take first stabs at that one.
Yeah, so I think that's a problem we haven't, I think we're aware that I don't think we've tackled it yet in our scheme, because you're right, we're getting thousands of notifications which are change of circumstances, and I think the main options are to apply tolerance, particularly with sticking with the default scheme, is kind of, you know, if the change, because quite often those notifications come in, it's a very small change or minimal change to income or entitlement. So can you apply tolerance so that you only apply a change to the scheme if it falls outside of that? I think some authorities have looked at actually they will only reassess a claim every 6 months or so, but that doesn't. So I think our research so far doesn't look like that's simple to implement, but I think we need to look at that. So I think, yeah, with the default scheme, I think they're probably the routes that we want to explore, and particularly as we expand automation. But yeah, that's still where we need to go, and I think that's probably going to be our direction in the future.
Okay, Zoe, thanks, Corin. Anything, Zoe, that you'd add to Corin's points?
Yeah, and we did model thresholds for one council just to see the impact it would have on billing. It was surprisingly few because so much changes were to do with household composition changes, and you mix that with liability changes, your actual proportion of billing that drops because of threshold changes was actually quite low. It was worthwhile and the council did go ahead with it, but it didn't have the greatest impact as could have, you know, as we had hoped for. So it's certainly worth looking at and modelling to see if thresholds would have an impact. But we've also had a look for one council. We looked at the impact of set award periods, and with that, what we can see is how many winners and losers there are at the end of that period. Any set award period often has to come with a proviso, i.e. you have a set award period, but you can ask the council to reassess. And obviously, in that case, people would be asking to reassess if their income goes down rather than their income goes up. And I think the council has to accept there's probably a cost implication of that. But in terms of administration, there are huge administration savings in having a set award period. And yes, that's something we have looked at for a council. I don't think many councils have gone down that route yet. That's not to say, I think as they need to make more and more savings through administration, and as you see notifications increase, as more people move over to universal credit, I think it's going to be one of the areas that's going to be more popular.
Brilliant, thank you. Zoe, if I could stick with you, if I may, for this next question. I am conscious of time, so thank you everybody for sticking with us. There's still lots of people on the call, so I'll keep going because we've got some cracking questions here. So this person is asking, do you have any advice for a two-tier authority? We are the main recipient of council tax income across the county, but district/borough councils are the ones that design the schemes and administer them. How feasible would it be to look at the impact of applying county-wide criteria?
Yeah, it wouldn't be the first county to do this. Alex has been working actually with the data in the past where we've done this. We've done it for 2 counties and their districts. It's a huge amount of organisation to get all councils to agree. I think if there's political differences between the districts, you might well have, it might be more difficult. The first point is to get all those districts together with the county and discuss this. We can come along We've done that before to actually try and find out what all those councils, what all their individual objectives are. But as Alex and Corin were both mentioned earlier, the objectives tend to differ between councils. That doesn't mean it's impossible. It has been done in a couple of counties where the districts have agreed together, but that was funded by the county. I think you have to look at the funding here, that if you're looking at a process of modelling for each district, looking at the impact at each district level and the process of change, that is going to be, there's going to be a cost implication which often worries the district councils. So it can be done. It's complex, but it's not something, it's something that you should start early, start the discussions, try and get the districts together. We'll help out as much as we can, but there will be a cost implication and the districts will expect that to be met by the county.
Brilliant, lovely. Thank you, Zoe. Food for thought there for someone. This person, question for you, Alex. In your opinion, which scheme provides the best mix of maximum award, but is also affordable for councils? And then there's a second part of the question which says, secondly, should we now be looking at bringing back council tax benefit as a national award to ensure fairness? So maybe you want to take the first part first. In your view, what's the best? Which model gives the best mix of maximum award, but it's also affordable?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's. I might take an easy way out and say it's different for different areas, for different councils, depending on what they've got now and what their budget is. I think income banded schemes are one way that you can reduce costs while maintaining that generosity. You know, making sure you still have 100% option for the most vulnerable residents is quite important. So yeah, if you're looking at one broad type of scheme, I'd say probably income banded, but then it's also just important to look at where your scheme is now, and any kind of tweaks that you can make. I think a really important one is what can you do with the universal credit data share? You know, if you're not doing any kind of automation there yet, you can make substantial savings in administration just by tweaking the scheme in the ways we mentioned before, so that you can take a lot of that information as an application. And remind me of the second part of that question?
The second part one is, should we be now looking at bringing back council tax benefit as a national award to ensure fairness? And I would welcome Zoe and finally Corin's view on that point as well, and then we can wrap up.
So I think it would be beneficial to have national funding of council tax support again. You know, at the moment it has been devolved to local authorities, and a lot of the need to make cuts to generosity has come through that. I think local authorities are quite well placed to understand poverty within their area, understand the specific kind of demographics of the lowest income residents in their area, and scheme design from that perspective can be quite powerful. So I think the main issue with the devolution is the funding aspect, and that is something that hopefully will be addressed. Let's see.
Lovely, thanks, Alex. Zoe, anything to add to that?
Absolutely, yes. That's just my own personal view. I'm not speaking for policy and practice there. I think when we look at the postcode lottery between councils in terms of poverty, in terms of the impact on residents, it's enormous. And this isn't the fault of councils. Because they have different pressures on the funding, they're forced to make different choices. But for the resident, they're not aware of that. They're not aware of the council funding position. They just know that they will be poorer in this borough than if they were in this borough. And if you're not ending up with, I also think that if you ended up with a national scheme, you end up with more integration with universal credit. At the moment, we know that there really isn't the time for work coaches or DWP to really ensure people are taking up other benefits. But it would be much better if it was automated and people knew that there was council tax benefit and there was universal credit, and they are national schemes. The council can still do their part. I mean, councils are certainly best placed to understand poverty. They're certainly best placed to deliver anti-poverty measures, maximise income. And if you were to include a small bit of localisation within that, perhaps just instead of having a council tax benefit scheme, you had some guidelines that councils must protect certain groups. They must ensure that their scheme is open to having 100% support for those who just cannot make costs meet costs. I think you could have national guidelines, but yeah, and that is my personal opinion. So I've put that out there, and I'm sure Corin's got a view as well.
Yes, Corin, we'll leave the last point to you. What would you say to that question?
As long as we have an equally as generous scheme, I think that's the most important point. I think for me that we provide 100% and strong backdating. Yes, that's what I want with the scheme.
Brilliant, lovely, thank you. We really have overrun quite substantially, so thank you very much to our speakers and to everybody that stayed with us as we have overrun. I'm going to end the webinar very shortly, and what will happen is a short survey will come up asking you for our feedback, but also giving you the opportunity to ask for further questions from our speakers. And I know we didn't get to cover all of the questions today, but we will take them offline and get back to you all individually with some thoughts from our speakers on that. So thank you very much for your interaction. Just a bit of a plug then for our next webinar on the 29th of March. That's how councils are using data to build their localities model. So do join us then. And when you get these slides, there's a couple of links in them here. And I point out again in the downloads on this webinar on the right hand side, in the handout section, you'll see the slide that Alex shared about the 10 factors to consider when designing your scheme. And also there's our policy and practice product brochure. It's got lots of case studies in there from our work with lots of different people. So do take a look at that. So thank you very much to our guest speaker, Corin Hammersley from Borough of Greenwich. Corin, it's been fantastic having you on the webinar today. Thank you very much for your time, and also thank you very much to Zoe and to Alex as well. And thank you for joining us, and I hope to see you on another Policy and Practice webinar very soon.